They said he was a monster, a cold-blooded killer in a $3,000 suit. But when the ceiling of the Venetian ballroom exploded, I didn't think. I just moved. I threw my body over the most dangerous man in the world, and I felt the glass tear into my skin so he wouldn't have to bleed. I expected to die. What I didn't expect was for him to look at me not with gratitude, but with a hunger that terrified me more than death itself. Because Julian St. Clair doesn't owe debts. He collects them. The tray of crystal flutes was heavy, digging into the crook of Sophie's arm, but she kept her spine straight. In the service industry, especially at a venue like the Pierre Hotel on Fifth Avenue, invisibility was a superpower. You had to be present enough to refill a glass of Dom Pérignon before the guest even realized it was empty, but absent enough that you didn't exist as a person. You were a ghost in a polyester vest. More bubbles, darling. A woman in a vintage Chanel gown snapped, not even looking at Sophie as she thrust her glass out. "Of course, Mom," Sophie whispered, pouring with practiced precision. Tonight was the St. Clair Charity Gala. The name St. Clair was whispered with a mix of reverence and fear in New York's high society. They owned shipping lines, tech conglomerates, and half the real estate in Manhattan. But rumors, dark, unsettling rumors, trailed them like smoke. People said they never aged. People said they held court at night and slept through the board meetings. Sophie didn't care about rumors. She cared that her rent in Queens was 3 days late, and her younger brother Toby needed new insulin pumps that insurance was refusing to cover. The St. Clair family tipped in cash, and they tipped heavy. That was all that mattered. "He's here," someone whispered near the orchestra pit. The air in the ballroom changed. It wasn't just a hush. It was a drop in temperature. The heavy oak doors swung open and he walked in. Julian St. Clair. He was taller than the photos in the New York Times suggested. He wore a tuxedo that fit so perfectly it looked like a second skin cut from midnight blue velvet. His hair was black, swept back from a face that was too sharp, too pale, and too beautiful to be entirely human. But it was his eyes that made Sophie's breath hitch in her throat. Even from across the room, under the golden light of the massive chandeliers, they looked like shards of ice. He moved through the crowd like a shark, parting a school of fish. Billionaires and senators stepped aside, bowing their heads slightly. He didn't acknowledge any of them. He looked bored, lethally bored. "Table 4 needs a refresh now, Sophie," the floor manager hissed into her earpiece. Sophie jumped and hurried toward table 4, the VIP table in the center of the room, directly under the main crystal chandelier. This was Julian's table. As she approached, the smell hit her. Not cologne, not sweat. It was the scent of rain on cold pavement and something metallic like copper. It was intoxicating. She reached for the empty bottle on the table, her hand trembling slightly. Julian was sitting right there, leaning back in his chair, one hand swirling a glass of deep red liquid that definitely wasn't the House Merlot. "Careful," a voice said. It was smooth like velvet wrapped around a razor blade. Sophie froze. Julian was looking at her, not through her like the others. He was looking at her. His pupils were blown wide, swallowing the iris. "I apologize, sir," Sophie stammered, gripping the tray. "I'll just clear this away." "You smell like fear," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "And vanilla." Sophie blinked. "It's my shampoo, sir, Suave, $2 at CVS. A corner of his mouth twitched. It wasn't a smile. It was a predator acknowledging prey. Fascinating. A girl who smells of cheap vanilla and absolute terror serving the wolves. "Julian," a man next to him warned. "Behave." Julian didn't look away from her. "I am behaving, Father. I'm just admiring the fragility of the staff." Sophie felt a cold sweat prickle down her back. Every instinct in her body was screaming at her to run. There was something wrong with him. The way he sat was too still. He hadn't blinked in 45 seconds. "Go," Julian said, dismissing her with a flick of his hand, "before you drop something." Sophie turned, her heart hammering against her ribs. She made it 3 steps away when she saw it. Up on the mezzanine level, nestled between the heavy velvet curtains of the balcony, a glint of metal caught the light. It wasn't a camera lens. Sophie had grown up in a rough neighborhood. She knew what a gun barrel looked like, and she knew what a laser sight looked like. A tiny red dot appeared on the back of Julian's velvet tuxedo jacket. Time seemed to slow down. The music from the string quartet warped into a low drone. The laughter of the crowd sounded like distant static. He didn't see it. The vampire prince, the predator, the apex killer. He was too busy being bored to notice the sniper rifle aimed at his spine. Sophie didn't think about her rent. She didn't think about Toby. She didn't think about the fact that she was a nobody. She dropped the tray. The crash of breaking crystal echoed through the hall, but she was already moving. "Get down!" she screamed. Julian St. Clair was fast, faster than any human had a right to be. At the sound of the tray dropping, he had already started to turn, his eyes narrowing. But he wasn't fast enough for a bullet traveling at 3,000 ft per second. But Sophie was already in the air. She launched herself at him. Not a graceful dive like in the movies, but a desperate, clumsy tackle. She slammed into his back, wrapping her arms around his neck and driving him forward off the chair. Crack! The sound was deafening. It wasn't just a gunshot. The bullet missed Julian by an inch because of Sophie's tackle, but it struck the massive crystal centerpiece on the table, a 2 feet tall sculpture of blown glass and steel. The sculpture exploded. Sophie squeezed her eyes shut and buried her face in the crook of Julian's neck as gravity took them down to the marble floor. She felt the impact first, the hard, cold stone against her knees, and then, a split second later, the rain. It wasn't water. It was hundreds of shards of razor-sharp crystal raining down on top of them. She gasped, her back arching involuntarily as the glass tore through her thin uniform vest and shirt. It felt like fire. Searing, white-hot lines of pain carved into her skin. One particularly large shard slammed into her shoulder blade, knocking the wind out of her. She grunted, her grip on Julian tightening. Silence fell over the ballroom. Absolute, terrified silence. Then the screaming started. "Assassin! Secure the exits. My God, is he dead?" Underneath her, Julian went rigid. He hadn't moved. He lay face down on the marble with Sophie draped over him like a human shield. Slowly, terrifyingly, he rolled over. Sophie slid off him, landing on the broken glass with a whimper. Her back was on fire. She couldn't breathe right. Julian sat up. He was pristine. Not a scratch on him. The bullet had missed. The glass had missed because Sophie had taken it all. He looked at her. His eyes were no longer icy blue. They were bleeding into a deep crimson red. His nostrils flared and a look of pure, unadulterated shock crossed his face. "You," he whispered. Sophie tried to push herself up, but her arms gave out. Did I save you?" She wheezed, blood dripping from her nose onto the white marble. Julian reached out his hand, hovering over her shoulder, where the fabric was torn and soaked in dark blood. He didn't touch her, but his hand trembled. For a vampire who had lived 300 years, trembling was a new sensation. "Why?" he demanded, his voice dropping to a growl that vibrated in Sophie's chest. "Why did you do that, little human?" "Red dot," she murmured, her vision blurring. "Saw red dot." Security guards in black suits swarmed them. "Mr. St. Clair, are you injured? We need to evacuate you immediately. The shooter is on the roof." Julian stood up, towering over the guards. He ignored them completely. He looked down at Sophie, who was now curling into a ball, trying to hide the pain. The smell of her blood was filling the air, sweet and potent. To the other vampires in the room, it was a dinner bell. Sophie could see heads turning in the crowd, eyes flashing that same dangerous red. Julian snarled. It was a vicious, animalistic sound that made the security guards step back in fear. "Back off," Julian commanded. "Sir, the paramedics are—" "I said back off," Julian roared. The glass on the floor rattled from the force of his voice. He bent down and scooped Sophie up into his arms, as if she weighed nothing. The movement pulled at the glass embedded in her back, and she cried out a sharp, broken sound. "Shh," Julian murmured, pulling her against his chest, heedless of the blood soaking his $3,000 tuxedo. "I have you. Hold on." My job," Sophie mumbled deliriously, her head lolling against his velvet lapel. "I'm going to get fired." "You're not getting fired, Sophie," he said grimly, striding toward the private exit, kicking the doors open with a force that shattered the lock. "You just got a promotion. You're mine now." The cold night air hit her face as he carried her out into the alleyway where a black Maybach was waiting. The world was spinning. The last thing Sophie saw before the darkness took her was Julian's face looking down at her with an expression that was halfway between worship and hunger. "Drive," Julian ordered the driver as he slid into the back seat with her. "Go to the estate. Don't stop for red lights. Don't stop for cops." "But sir," the driver stammered, looking in the rearview mirror at the bleeding waitress. "She needs a hospital." Julian looked down at the shard of glass protruding from her shoulder. He placed his hand over her heart, feeling the frantic, dying rhythm of it. "A hospital can't fix this," Julian said, his eyes glowing in the dark of the car. "She bled for a king. She doesn't get treated like a commoner." He bit his own wrist, the skin breaking instantly. He held it over her lips. "Drink," he whispered. The metallic taste hit Sophie's tongue first, copper and salt, hot and thick. Instinctively, she wanted to gag, to pull away. It was unnatural. It was wrong. But as the first drop of Julian's blood slid down her throat, something shifted in her biology. The pain in her back, which had been a screaming white-hot agony, suddenly dulled. It was replaced by a thrumming electric heat that spread from her stomach to her fingertips. "Drink," Julian commanded again, his voice echoing inside her head, not through her ears. "Or you die right here on the leather seats of my car." Sophie drank. She didn't have a choice. Her survival instinct overrode her humanity. As she swallowed, she felt a bizarre sensation, a popping sound followed by the wet slide of movement. The shards of glass embedded in her back were being pushed out by her own skin. The wounds were knitting themselves together at supernatural speed. She gasped, pulling away from his wrist, her chest heaving. The interior of the Maybach came back into focus. They were moving incredibly fast, the city lights blurring into streaks of neon. Julian watched her, his eyes still glowing that terrifying crimson. He licked his own wrist, sealing the wound instantly. "Better." "What?" "What did you do to me?" Sophie whispered. She reached over her shoulder. The fabric of her uniform was shredded and stiff with dried blood, but the skin underneath felt smooth. I'm not bleeding." "Vampire blood is a potent regenerative," Julian said, leaning back, the predator's intensity fading back into his usual mask of bored arrogance. "But it comes with a price." Sophie froze. "Price? You have ingested the blood of a St. Clair. In our laws, that makes you complicated. You are no longer just a human, you are refined." "I don't know what that means," she snapped, a spark of her queen's attitude returning despite the fear. "And I need to go home. My brother Toby, he needs his insulin. I have to pick it up from the pharmacy before midnight." Julian let out a dark, humorous chuckle. "You think you're going back to your apartment? Sophie, you just tackled the heir to the East Coast Vampire Dominion in front of 200 witnesses. The sniper who missed me saw your face. If I drop you off in Queens, you'll be dead before you unlock your front door." The car swerved smoothly off the highway, entering a long, winding driveway lined with ancient oak trees that blocked out the moon. They approached a massive wrought-iron gate that swung open automatically. "Where are we?" Sophie asked, pressing her hand against the cold glass of the window. "Safe," Julian said. "This is Blackwood Estate." The car stopped in front of a mansion that looked like it had been transported brick by brick from 18th century France, but updated with modern, brutalist security features. Cameras with red blinking eyes swiveled to track the car. Armed guards who moved with the same unnatural grace as Julian patrolled the perimeter. The driver opened the door and Julian stepped out, extending a hand to Sophie. "Come." Sophie hesitated. She looked at his hand, pale, elegant, and deadly. Then she looked at the dark woods surrounding them. She took his hand. As soon as her skin touched his, a jolt of static electricity snapped between them, loud enough to hear. Julian stiffened, his eyes widening. He pulled her closer, sniffing her hair again. "Curious," he murmured. "Very curious." Before Sophie could ask what was curious, the massive oak front doors banged open. A man stood there, older than Julian, but bearing the same sharp features. He held a cane topped with a silver wolf's head, and his presence was so heavy it made the air hard to breathe. "Lucius St. Clair, quoi? The king. You bring a stray dog into my house, Julian. After a failed assassination attempt, you should be hunting the shooter, not playing nursemaid to the help. Lucius boomed, his voice shaking the leaves off the nearby trees. She saw the shooter, father, Julian said calmly, keeping a grip on Sophie's arm that was possessive, almost protective. And she took a bullet meant for my spine. The glass shattered on her, not me. Lucius walked down the stone steps. He didn't walk. He glided. He stopped inches from Sophie. She could smell the age on him like old parchment and dried blood. He grabbed her chin, tilting her face up to the moonlight. A waitress. Lucius sneered, inspecting her like a piece of livestock. From the Pierre, minimal education, debt-ridden, no family of consequence. "Hey," Sophie said, slapping his hand away. "Don't touch me." The guards by the door gasped. The driver took a step back. Nobody touched Lucius St. Clair. Lucius stared at her, stunned. Then a slow, cruel smile spread across his face. "She has spirit," Lucius said. "Pity. She'll make a messy corpse." "She is under my protection," Julian interjected, stepping between his father and Sophie. His voice dropped an octave, vibrating with a growl that was purely animalistic. "She drank my blood, father. The bond is sealed." Lucius's eyes snapped to Julian's. "You gave a human the vitae without the council's permission." "I saved a life that saved mine," Julian said. "Call it a debt repaid." "It's not a debt," Lucius hissed. "It's a target. If the assassin knows she matters to you, they will use her to get to you. You haven't saved her, boy. You've just guaranteed her torture." Lucius turned and walked back into the house. "Lock her in the east wing. If she tries to leave, break her legs. We can't have her running to the police." Sophie watched the old man leave, her heart hammering. "Break my legs." Julian turned to her, his expression unreadable. "He's exaggerating." "Mostly. Come inside, Sophie. Welcome to your new life. Try not to break anything else." Sophie woke up in a bed that was bigger than her entire apartment living room. The sheets were Egyptian cotton, counting at least 1,000 threads, cool and silky against her skin. For a moment she forgot. She stretched, expecting to hear the traffic noise of Queens, the shouting of her neighbors. Instead, there was silence. Absolute, heavy silence. Then the memories crashed into her. The gala, the laser sight, the glass, the blood. She sat up, gasping. Her hand flew to her back. She ran her fingers over her skin. It was flawless. No scars, no scabs, just smooth, unblemished skin. "It wasn't a nightmare," she whispered. She looked around the room. It was opulent, decorated in shades of cream and gold. A massive floor-to-ceiling window overlooked the estate grounds. She scrambled out of bed, realizing she was wearing an oversized silk shirt that definitely wasn't hers, and ran to the window. Miles from civilization, just endless forest and high stone walls. "My brother!" she panicked. "Toby!" She looked around for a phone. There was nothing, no landline. Her cell phone was gone, likely lost at the hotel or taken by Julian. She ran to the door and tried the handle. Locked. "Hello?" She banged on the wood. "Let me out. I need to call my brother." Quiet. A voice came from the other side. "Mr. St. Clair is sleeping. It is daytime." "I don't care if he's dead," Sophie screamed. "Open this door." Click. The lock turned and the door swung open, but it wasn't Julian. Standing in the hallway was a woman who looked like she had just stepped off a runway in Milan. She was tall, with platinum blonde hair cut in a sharp bob and eyes that were a disturbing shade of violet. She wore a white power suit that cost more than Sophie would earn in 10 years. "Sir," the woman said, looking Sophie up and down with open disdain, "this is the pet." "I'm not a pet," Sophie said, stepping into the hallway. "I'm a hostage. Who are you?" "I'm Cecilia Vance," the woman said, flashing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Julian's fiancée, and the woman whose engagement party you ruined last night." Sophie blinked. "Fiancée?" He didn't mention a fiancée. "Men like Julian rarely mention their obligations," Cecilia said, stepping closer. She smelled of expensive lilies and decay. "He's infatuated with the novelty of you. A little human who played hero. It's adorable, really, but let's be clear, you are temporary. I am forever." "I don't want him," Sophie said honestly. "I just want to go home to my brother." Cecilia's eyes narrowed. The diabetic boy, Toby, 14 years old, goes to Roosevelt High. Sophie's blood ran cold. How do you know that? We're vampires, darling. We know everything. Cecilia examined her perfectly manicured nails. We already sent a courier with a 6-month supply of insulin to your apartment. A cover story was planted that you've been hired for a private catering gig in the Hamptons. Your brother is fine. He thinks you're making big money. Sophie slumped against the doorframe, relief washing over her so hard she almost cried. He got the medicine? Yes, Cecilia said. Julian's orders. He seems to think keeping your little liability alive will keep you docile. Cecilia leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper. But here is the reality check. You saw the shooter's position. Julian thinks it was an outside hit, but you and I both know outsiders can't get a rifle into the Pierre Hotel without help. Sophie stared at her. What are you saying? I'm saying, Cecilia smirked, that if you remember anything about that shooter, a face, a tattoo, a smell, you keep your mouth shut, because accidents happen in this house all the time. Maids fall downstairs, cooks cut their fingers off. Do you understand? Sophie realized then that Cecilia wasn't just jealous, she was worried. You know who did it, Sophie whispered. Cecilia's face hardened. She grabbed Sophie's wrist. The grip was like a steel vice. You are a small, fragile thing in a world of monsters. Julian finds you amusing for now, but when he gets bored, you're just food. Remember that. She shoved Sophie back into the room and slammed the door. Sophie stood there, rubbing her bruised wrist. Her fear was transforming into something else. Anger. Cold, hard anger. She went to the closet. It was filled with clothes, designer dresses, silk blouses, heels. Julian had clearly been busy while she slept. She ignored the dresses and found a pair of black yoga pants and a cashmere sweater. She got dressed. She wasn't going to wait to be rescued, and she wasn't going to wait to be eaten. She went to the window again, 3 stories down, but there was a trellis covered in thick ivy. Sophie opened the window. Okay, Sophie, you threw yourself at a vampire. You can climb a vine. She swung her legs out. She had to get to a phone. She had to call Toby herself to make sure he was really okay. She climbed down, her sneakers slipping on the stone. Halfway down, she heard voices below. She froze, pressing herself into the ivy. 2 guards were standing near the rose garden, smoking. The king is furious, one said. He thinks it was the Lichen clans. It wasn't Lichens, the other replied, lowering his voice. I saw the security footage before it was wiped. The shooter on the balcony. He was wearing a St. Clair crest ring. Sophie gasped. Her hand slipped. Leaves rustled loudly. Both guards looked up. Hey, the girl. Sophie didn't hesitate. She let go, dropping the last 10 FRA. She hit the grass, rolled and sprinted toward the woods. Stop her! Alarms began to blare across the estate. Sophie ran. She was fast, faster than she used to be. The blood, it had given her stamina. She tore through the woods, branches whipping her face. Suddenly a shadow dropped from the trees directly in front of her. Julian landed in a crouch, one hand touching the earth, looking like a dark angel of death. He stood up slowly, blocking her path. Going somewhere? He asked, his voice deceptively calm. Your fiancé threatened me, Sophie panted, backing away. And your guards are saying the shooter was one of you. This is a trap. I'm not staying here to be collateral damage. Julian's expression darkened. What did you say about the shooter? I heard them, Sophie yelled. They said he had a St. Clair ring. It was an inside job, Julian. Your father or your fiancé or someone in this twisted family wants you dead. Julian went still. The air around him seemed to vibrate. If that's true, he said softly, then you are the only witness who can identify the traitor. He stepped closer, looming over her. Which means leaving this estate is a death sentence. You have to trust me. Why should I? Sophie cried. You're a monster. Julian moved so fast she didn't see it. In a blink, he was behind her, his chest pressed against her back, his lips brushing her ear. Because, he whispered, I'm the only monster who wants to keep you alive. Julian's breath was cold against Sophie's nape, a stark contrast to the heat radiating from her own body. His hand rested on her waist, and for a second she felt the sheer power he was suppressing. He could snap her in two without trying, yet his touch was almost hesitant. I'm not your prisoner, Sophie hissed, though she didn't pull away. You are my responsibility. Julian corrected. He turned her around to face him. His eyes were back to that piercing, icy blue, but they were narrowed in thought. If what you heard the guard say is true, that the shooter wore a St. Clair ring, then the walls of this house are the most dangerous place in the world for both of us. So let me go, Sophie pleaded. I'll disappear. I'll take Toby and move to Florida. No one has to know I saw anything. Julian leaned in, his face inches from hers. Vampires have memories that span centuries, Sophie. They don't leave loose ends. If you leave my sight, you'll be dead within the hour. The only reason you're still breathing is because I have claimed you. He grabbed her hand and began pulling her back toward the mansion, but not toward the main entrance. He led her toward a hidden stone cellar door overgrown with moss. Where are we going? To the one place my father's cameras don't reach, Julian said. They descended into a dim, stone-walled chamber that smelled of earth and aged wine. It was a private sanctuary filled with ancient books and a single leather armchair. Julian locked the heavy iron door behind them. My father didn't order that hit, Julian said, pacing the small room. If Lucius wanted me dead, I'd be ash. He's cruel, but he's obsessed with the lineage. But Cecilia, she threatened me, Sophie said, her voice trembling. She knew about Toby. She knew his school, his condition. She's using him to keep me quiet. Julian stopped pacing. A low, guttural growl vibrated in his throat. Cecilia Vance is a daughter of the oldest clan in Europe. Our marriage was meant to solidify a treaty. If she's trying to eliminate me, it means her family is planning a coup. He looked at Sophie, his gaze softening into something that looked dangerously like concern. I need you to remember, when you saw that red dot, did you see the shooter's hands? Did you see the ring? Sophie closed her eyes, trying to block out the terror of the ballroom. She pictured the mezzanine, the velvet curtains. It was fast, but when the rifle recoiled, I saw a flash of silver, a seal with a bird, an eagle, a hawk, Julian whispered. The Vance family crest. The realization hit the room like a physical weight. It wasn't just a family squabble, it was an act of war. Suddenly a muffled explosion rocked the foundation of the house. The lights in the cellar flickered and died. Julian. Sophie reached out in the dark, her heart hammering. Stay behind me, Julian commanded. His voice had changed. It was deeper, more resonant. The iron door of the cellar was ripped off its hinges with a scream of tortured metal. Standing in the doorway was not Cecilia, but a man Sophie didn't recognize. A massive, scarred vampire in a tactical vest holding a suppressed submachine gun. The king sends his regards, Prince, the man sneered. Liar, Julian spat. You're Vance's lapdog. The man opened fire. The room erupted in chaos. Julian didn't move away. He moved forward into the line of fire. He moved so fast he was a blur, his hands catching the shooter's throat, before the second round could leave the chamber. Sophie dived behind the heavy leather armchair, glass and stone chips flying over her head. She heard the sound of bone snapping and a wet thud. Julian stood over the body of the assassin, his tuxedo shirt torn, his eyes glowing a violent, pulsating red. He looked less like a man and more like a god of death. We have to go now, Julian said, grabbing Sophie's arm. But your father... If the Vance guards are inside the house, the estate has already fallen, Julian said grimly. My father is either fighting for his life or already incapacitated. We are the only targets that matter now. They ran through the sublevels of the house, bypassing the main halls where the sounds of screaming and gunfire were now echoing. Julian led her to a garage hidden behind a false wall in the wine cellar. Inside sat a vintage 1967 Chevy Impala, pitch black and modified with reinforced steel plates. Can you drive? Julian asked, tossing her the keys. I'm from Queens, Julian. I've been driving since I was 12. Good, because I need to keep my hands free for the gate. Sophie slid into the driver's seat, the engine roaring to life with a primal growl. Julian jumped into the passenger seat, his claws extended, his fangs fully descended. Go! Floor it! Sophie slammed the car into gear and floored the accelerator. The car fishtailed out of the garage, screaming across the gravel. As they approached the main gates, 3 black SUVs swung around to block their path. Don't stop! Julian yelled. He leaned out the window, and Sophie watched in horror and awe as he leaped from the moving car onto the hood of the lead SUV. He tore through the roof like it was made of paper, pulling the driver out and throwing him into the woods. "Julian!" Sophie screamed as the other SUVs opened fire on the Impala. The bulletproof glass spiderwebbed but held. Sophie didn't lift her foot off the gas. She rammed the lead SUV, pushing it aside with a screech of metal, and tore through the gap. Julian leaped back onto the roof of the Impala, his fingers digging into the metal to hold on. "Keep going. Head for the city. They won't risk a public massacre in Manhattan." As they flew down the dark highway, Sophie looked in the rearview mirror. The estate was glowing. A fire had started in the East Wing. Her life, her job, her anonymity, it was all burning back there. "You're bleeding again," Julian said, sliding back into the passenger seat through the window. Sophie looked down. A shard of glass from the earlier cellar explosion had grazed her arm. "It's nothing. I'll heal right. Your blood is in me." Julian took her arm, his eyes fixated on the crimson streak. The hunger in his expression was terrifying, but he fought it down. He leaned over and licked the wound, his saliva acting as a numbing agent, sealing the cut. "You saved me twice now, Sophie," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Once at the gala and once in that cellar." "I told you," Sophie said, her voice shaking. "I didn't think. I couldn't let you die." Julian looked at her, really looked at her. "You are the most inconvenient thing that has ever happened to me in 300 years. "Glad to be of service," she joked weakly. "I mean it," Julian said, his hand moving to the back of her head, drawing her closer even as she steered the car. "I have spent my life surrounded by people who wanted my power, my money, or my blood. You are the only person who ever gave me yours for nothing in return." Before Sophie could respond, his phone, a burner he'd grabbed from the cellar, buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "I have the boy. If you want him to keep breathing, bring the waitress to the Pier 54 warehouse by dawn alone." Sophie saw the screen. Her heart stopped. Toby. Julian's grip on the phone tightened until the screen cracked. "Cecilia, we have to go there," Sophie said, her voice becoming cold and hard. "Julian, if they hurt him—" "They won't," Julian promised. But for the first time, he sounded afraid. "Because if they do, I will burn this city to the ground until there is nothing left but ash and bone." The fog rolling off the Hudson River wasn't like the natural mist of the morning. It was thick, cloying, and smelled of ozone and stagnant salt water. It clung to the rusted girders of Pier 54, a place that had once been a gateway to the world, but was now a graveyard of industrial rot. Sophie's hands were white-knuckled on the steering wheel of the black Impala, her knuckles stark against the worn leather. Beside her, Julian sat in a silence so profound it felt like the vacuum before a storm. "The sensor on the dash is spiking," Julian said, his voice a low melodic vibration. He wasn't looking at her. His eyes were fixed on the looming silhouette of the warehouse ahead. "There are at least 6 of them in Sulphur. Highborns, they aren't hiding their scent. They want me to know they're waiting." "They have Toby," Sophie said, her voice cracking. "I don't care if there are 60 of them." Julian finally turned his head. In the dim glow of the dashboard lights, his features looked like they had been carved from moonlight and marble. "Sophie, listen to me very carefully. You are the only reason I am still upright. That blood in your veins, my blood, it's doing things to your biology that we don't fully understand yet. You're faster, you're stronger, but you are still mortal. If things go wrong, I need you to run. Don't look back for me, don't look back for anyone. I'm not leaving without my brother Julian. And I'm not leaving without you," she countered, her queen's grit surfacing. "You told me you don't owe debts. Well, neither do I. We're finishing this together." Julian reached out his cool fingers, brushing the hair away from her face. For a fleeting second, the predatory mask slipped, revealing a profound, ancient loneliness. Then he nodded once. They stepped out of the car into the biting cold. The wind whipped Sophie's thin jacket, but she didn't shiver. The heat from Julian's blood was still thrumming in her marrow, a strange electric insulation against the world. The warehouse doors were massive corrugated steel sheets that had been pried open just enough for a person to slip through. As they entered, the sound of the city, the distant sirens, the hum of the West Side Highway, faded into a heavy, unnatural silence. The interior was cavernous, lit by a few flickering industrial floodlights that cast long, distorted shadows across piles of abandoned shipping crates. In the center of the vast floor, illuminated by a single harsh spotlight, sat a lone wooden chair. "Toby!" Sophie cried out, her voice echoing off the metal rafters. The boy in the chair jumped. He was gagged with heavy silver tape, his hands bound behind his back with zip ties, his eyes wide and bloodshot with terror, locked onto Sophie's. He tried to scream, but it came out as a muffled, panicked grunt. Tears. How incredibly suburban. A voice drawled from the darkness. Cecilia Vance stepped into the light. She looked immaculate, not a hair out of place despite the chaos at the estate. She wore a long slate-grey coat and gloves made of the finest calfskin. Behind her, 5 men emerged from the shadows. They weren't the hired muscle Sophie had seen earlier. These were Vance family elites. They moved with a synchronized predatory grace that made the hair on Sophie's arm stand up. "You're late." "Julian," Cecilia said, tilting her head, "I was beginning to think you'd decided the girl wasn't worth the risk to your precious monarchy." "The monarchy is fine, Cecilia," Julian said, stepping forward. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't need to. The air around him began to distort, the temperature in the room dropping 10 degrees in seconds. "Your father is currently being interrogated by the council. Your coup died in the cradle." Cecilia's face didn't twitch. "My father was a sentimental fool. He wanted a seat at the table. I want to flip the table over, and I have the leverage to do it." She placed a gloved hand on Toby's shoulder. Her nails sharpened into points dug into the boy's skin. Toby winced, a small whimper escaping his throat. "Don't touch him!" Sophie stepped forward, but one of the Vance guards was suddenly in front of her, his hand moving toward her throat. Before the guard could connect, Julian was there. It wasn't a movement Sophie could follow with her eyes. It was a blur of black and a sickening crack. The guard was sent flying 50 FT backward, crashing into a stack of pallets with enough force to splinter the wood into toothpicks. Julian stood in front of Sophie, his fangs fully extended, his eyes a brilliant, terrifying crimson. "The next person who moves toward her dies a screaming death," he snarled. Cecilia laughed, a cold, melodic sound that chilled Sophie more than the wind. Such passion for a little human who serves drinks for a living. But that's the secret, isn't it, Julian? She's not just a human anymore. Cecilia pulled a small glass vial from her pocket. It was filled with a shimmering, iridescent fluid. "I did a little research while I was waiting. I took a sample of the blood from the glass shards at the hotel, the ones that came out of Sophie's back." Sophie felt a cold pit form in her stomach. "Julian's blood is ancient," Cecilia continued, pacing around Toby's chair. "But when it entered your system, Sophie, something miraculous happened. Your body didn't reject it. It didn't turn you into a mindless ghoul. It bonded. Your human DNA is stabilizing the St. Clair strain. You are the catalyst. With your blood, we don't need the dark. We don't need the shadows. We could walk in the sun, Julian. We could be gods among the sheep, not just wolves in the night." "I have no interest in being a god," Julian spat. "I just want my city back, and I want the boy." "You can have him," Cecilia said, her eyes flashing violet. "In exchange for her. Give me the girl and the boy walks out of here. He goes back to Queens, gets his insulin, and lives a long, boring human life. But Sophie stays with me. My researchers have so many questions for her bone marrow." "No," Sophie whispered. "Never." Julian growled. "I thought you'd say that." Cecilia sighed. She reached into her coat and pulled out a remote detonator. "You see, the Vance family doesn't just play with blood. We play with fire. This pier is rigged with thermite charges. One click, and the boy goes into the Hudson in a ball of flame. And since you've so kindly brought the catalyst to war to me, I don't need her to be willing. I just need her intact-ish." The tension in the room was a physical weight. Sophie looked at Toby. He was shaking, tears streaming down his face. He was 14. He had a whole life ahead of him. He deserved to go to prom, to graduate, to fail and succeed and grow old. She looked at Julian. He was coiled like a spring, ready to sacrifice everything to save her. But he couldn't beat a detonator. Even he wasn't faster than an electrical signal. Wait, Sophie said, her voice loud and clear in the echoing warehouse. Sophie, don't, Julian warned, his voice thick with agony. I'll go with her, Sophie said, stepping out from behind Julian. She looked Cecilia in the eye. If you let him go, if you let Julian walk him to the car and let them drive away, I'll stay. I'll give you whatever you want. Cecilia smirked. A martyr. How charmingly New York of you, Sophie. I will burn the world before I let her take you, Julian hissed, his hand catching her wrist. Sophie turned to him. She stood on her tiptoes and pulled his head down, whispering into his ear. The glass shattered on my back for you, Julian. Now trust me. When I say now, you take Toby and you jump. Julian's eyes searched hers. He saw the fire there, the same fire that had driven her to tackle him at the gala. He realized she wasn't surrendering. She was planning. Fine, Julian said, his voice sounding hollow. He stepped back. Cecilia gestured to one of her guards. Take the boy to the edge of the pier. Once Julian is in the car, we trade. The guard grabbed Toby's chair and dragged it toward the loading dock doors, which stood open to the black, churning water of the Hudson. The drop was 30 feet into a graveyard of jagged pilings and icy currents. Sophie walked toward Cecilia, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. As she passed Julian, she felt the sheer, agonizing restraint he was exercising. Closer, darling, Cecilia said, reaching out to take Sophie's arm. As Cecilia's gloved hand closed around Sophie's wrist, Sophie didn't pull away. She lunged. But she didn't lunge for the detonator. She lunged for the vial of blood in Cecilia's other hand. Now! Sophie screamed. Sophie's fingers closed around the glass vial, and she slammed her forehead into Cecilia's nose. The sound of cartilage breaking was loud in the silence. Cecilia shrieked, dropping the detonator. Julian didn't hesitate. He didn't go for Cecilia. He trusted Sophie's command. He moved like a lightning strike, reaching Toby and the guard in a fraction of a second. He tore the guard's arm from its socket and scooped Toby, chair and all, into his massive arms. Sophie! Julian roared. Cecilia, blood streaming from her nose, scrambled for the detonator on the floor. You bitch! I'll kill you both! Sophie didn't run for the door. She knew she wouldn't make it. Instead, she threw the vial of iridescent blood at the industrial floodlight nearest to the thermite charge on the central pillar. The glass shattered. The highly flammable, oxygenated vampire blood hit the white-hot halogen bulb. Boom! The light exploded into a fireball. The heat was instantaneous, triggering the nearby thermite. A wall of blue and white flame erupted between Sophie and Cecilia. The shockwave threw Sophie backward. She felt the floor beneath her give way, the old rotted wood finally surrendering to the stress. She was falling. The air rushed past her, cold and smelling of salt. She braced for the impact of the water, for the dark embrace of the Hudson. But the impact never came. A pair of arms, strong as steel and cold as ice, caught her mid-air. Julian had leaped from the loading dock, Toby tucked under one arm, catching Sophie with the other. They hit the water together. The cold was absolute. It felt like 1,000 needles piercing Sophie's skin. The current was vicious, pulling at her clothes, trying to drag her under the pier. But Julian's grip was unshakable. He kicked with supernatural strength, cutting through the water like a shark. They surfaced 50 yards downriver near a rusted ladder. Julian shoved Toby onto the rungs first, then hoisted Sophie up. They scrambled onto the muddy bank, gasping for air. Behind them, Pier 54 was a pyre. The thermite had turned the warehouse into a skeleton of glowing orange metal. Screams echoed from within, the Vance guards who hadn't been fast enough. Cecilia's fate was unknown, swallowed by the inferno. Toby was shaking, sobbing as he ripped the tape from his mouth. Sophie! Sophie, are you okay? Sophie collapsed onto the wet gravel, her lungs burning, her clothes soaked and freezing. I'm okay, Toby, I've got you. Julian stood over them, his silhouette framed by the fire. He looked down at his hands. They were shaking. The Prince of New York. The man who had lived through centuries of war was trembling. He dropped to his knees in front of Sophie, ignoring the mud. He grabbed her face in his hands, his thumbs wiping the river water from her cheeks. You stayed, he whispered, his voice breaking. You could have run. and you stayed to fight." "I told you," Sophie wheezed, a small, tired smile touching her lips. "I'm a Queen's girl. We don't walk away from a fight." Julian leaned forward, pressing his forehead against hers. For the first time, he didn't smell like rain or copper. He smelled like wood smoke and survival. "The vial," Julian said. "You destroyed the only sample of the catalyst." "Good," Sophie said. "I don't want to be a miracle. I just want to be Sophie." "You are both," Julian murmured. He looked up at the burning pier, then back at the city lights of Manhattan. The sun was beginning to bleed over the horizon, turning the sky a bruised purple. "We have to move," Julian said, standing and pulling Sophie up with him. "My father's men will be here soon, and after what happened tonight, the council will never stop looking for you." "But what do we do?" Toby asked, looking between the two of them. Julian looked at Sophie. The bond between them, the blood she had taken, the blood she had shed, felt like a physical cord vibrating with a new, terrifying intensity. "We go underground," Julian said. "We disappear. I have properties they don't know about, accounts they can't trace." "And then what?" Sophie asked. Julian's eyes grew dark, the red fading back into a deep regal blue. "And then we take back what is ours. You saved my life twice, Sophie. From now on, my life is yours. My house, my blood, my protection. They are yours until the sun burns out." Sophie looked at the fire, then at her brother, then at the monster who had become her anchor. She reached out and took Julian's hand. His skin was cold, but for the first time in her life, Sophie felt truly warm. "Then let's go," she said. "We have work to do." As they walked toward the car, the first rays of the sun hit the top of the Empire State Building. The world was changing. The age of the St. Clair Kings was ending, and the age of the Catalyst was beginning. The glass had shattered, but the pieces were finally being put back together into a shape far more dangerous and far more beautiful than before. And that, my friends, is how the glass that shattered on a waitress's back changed the course of vampire history forever. Sophie entered the Pierre Hotel looking for a tip, and she left it as the most powerful woman in the underworld. Julian Saint. Claire found something more valuable than blood or power. He found a reason to fight for the future. But don't think for a second that the Vance family is gone. The shadows of New York are long, and secrets have a way of crawling out of the fire. If you enjoyed this epic tale of blood, betrayal, and glass, hit that like button right now. It helps us bring more of these cinematic stories to life. Comment, stay clear, if you want to see a sequel where Sophie discovers the true extent of her powers. And most importantly, subscribe and turn on all notifications. We post new dramas every week, and you don't want to miss what's coming next. Thanks for listening, and remember, keep your eyes open because the monsters are closer than you.